In the summer of 1565, the sea around a small island turned red. Knights were beheaded, their bodies nailed to wooden crosses and set floating across the harbor as a warning. Soldiers were burned alive in their own forts. When the smoke finally cleared, one of the most powerful empires on earth had suffered a defeat it never expected. This is the story of the siege that shook the Ottoman Empire to its core. To understand why the siege happened, we need to go back further to a group of warrior monks known as the Knights of St. John, also called the Knights Hospitaller. These men were part religious order, part military force. They had started centuries earlier caring for sick pilgrims in Jerusalem, but over time they became something else entirely: trained fighters, skilled sailors, and fierce defenders of the Christian faith in the Mediterranean Sea. After being pushed out of the Holy Land and later out of the island of Rhodes, the Knights eventually settled on a rocky, dry island called Malta. It was given to them by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in 1530 for the yearly rent of just one falcon. Malta was not rich, it had little farmland, few trees, and a harsh climate, but it had something far more valuable than fertile soil location. Malta sat right in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea between Europe and North Africa, close to the shipping routes the Ottoman Empire used to move troops, supplies, and treasure. Whoever controlled Malta could control much of the sea traffic in the region. For the Knights, this meant they could use Malta as a base to attack Ottoman ships. Their galleys, fast and deadly, raided Muslim merchant vessels and even ships carrying pilgrims to Mecca. This constant raiding was a deep insult and a real economic problem for the Ottoman Empire. At the head of the Ottoman Empire sat Sultan Sulayman I, known in the West as Sulayman the Magnificent. By 1565, he was an old man but still one of the most powerful rulers in the world. His empire stretched across 3 continents. Decades earlier, in 1522, Sulayman had already fought the Knights once before when they were based on the island of Rhodes. That siege had lasted 6 months. In the end, Sulayman allowed the surviving Knights to leave Rhodes with dignity, impressed by their courage. But now, more than 40 years later, those same Knights were causing him trouble again, this time from Malta. Sulayman decided enough was enough. He wanted them destroyed completely, and he wanted Malta to become a permanent Ottoman naval base in the western Mediterranean. Leading the defense of Malta was a man named Jean Parisot de Valette. He was the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John, and by 1565 he was around 70 years old. De Valette was not a soft, elderly leader hiding behind younger soldiers. He had spent almost his entire adult life fighting. He had survived the siege of Rhodes as a young knight. He had once been captured by Ottoman forces and spent about a year as a galley slave, chained to an oar before being freed in a prisoner exchange. This personal history mattered. De Valette understood exactly what kind of enemy he was facing because he had lived among them as a prisoner. He knew their tactics, their patience, and their brutality. This experience shaped how he prepared Malta for the attack that he knew eventually would come. When Sulayman finally committed to the invasion, he sent one of the largest military expeditions the Ottoman Empire had ever launched by sea. Historians estimate the Ottoman force numbered somewhere between 30 and 40,000 fighting men, carried by roughly 200 ships. This included elite Janissary infantry, the Sultan's most trusted and feared soldiers, along with thousands of other troops, engineers, and gunners. Against this massive force, de Valette had only a small number of defenders. Estimates suggest around 600 Knights of the Order, along with several thousand Maltese soldiers, mercenaries, and armed local civilians, bringing the total defense force to somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people. On paper, the odds looked impossible. The Ottoman fleet arrived off the coast of Malta in mid-May of 1565. The commanders of this massive invasion force included Piel Pasha, an admiral in charge of the navy, and Mustafa Pasha, a general leading the land forces. Sultan Sulayman had given command to 2 men instead of 1, which would later create problems, since the 2 often disagreed on strategy. Also present was Dragut, an aging but legendary Ottoman corsair and admiral feared across the Mediterranean for decades. Dragut arrived a bit later than the main force, but his experience and knowledge of Malta's coastline made him one of the most valuable commanders on the Ottoman side. When the Ottomans landed, Mustafa Pasha made a decision that would prove costly. Instead of immediately attacking the main strongholds of Birgu and Singlia, where de Valette and most of his forces were concentrated, Mustafa chose to first attack a smaller fort guarding the entrance to the Grand Harbor. This fort was called Fort St. Elmo. It was a star-shaped structure, relatively small and manned by a modest garrison of knights and soldiers. Mustafa believed Fort St. Elmo would fall within a few days. This single decision would cost the Ottomans weeks of time, thousands of soldiers, and one of their most respected commanders. What followed at Fort St. Elmo became one of the most brutal chapters of the entire siege. The Ottomans set up their cannons on the high ground overlooking the fort and began a relentless bombardment. Day after day, the walls of St. Elmo were pounded with cannon fire. The defenders inside, though badly outnumbered, refused to surrender. Every night, small boats would cross the harbor from Birgu, bringing reinforcements, food, and ammunition to the fort's defenders, keeping the resistance alive even as the walls crumbled around them. The fighting inside and around the fort became close and vicious, often hand-to-hand, with swords, pikes, and knives replacing gunfire once the Ottomans breached the outer defenses. During this stage of the siege, Dragut personally supervised the placement of new gun batteries to increase the pressure on the fort. But on the 18th of June, while inspecting the siege lines, Dragut was struck by a splinter or fragment from cannon fire, according to most historical accounts, and died a few days later from his wounds. His death was a serious blow to Ottoman morale. Here was a man who had terrorized the Mediterranean for the Ottomans for decades, and he had died not in a great naval battle, but slowly, from a wound sustained watching cannons fire on a small fort that refused to fall. Fort St. Elmo did eventually fall, but only after nearly a month of fighting, far longer than the few days the Ottoman command had expected. On the 23rd of June 1565, Ottoman forces finally overran what remained of the fort. Almost every defender inside was killed. Contemporary accounts describe how the surviving handful of wounded knights were finished off, showing little mercy after such a long and costly fight. But it was what happened after the fort's fall that truly shocked Europe and revealed just how brutal this siege had become. Mustafa Pasha, angry and frustrated by the unexpectedly high losses his forces had taken to capture a fort meant to fall in days, ordered a gruesome act meant to break the spirits of the remaining defenders across the harbor in Birgu and Singlia. The bodies of dead knights were decapitated, and their corpses were nailed to wooden crosses. These crosses, bearing the mutilated bodies of Christian knights, were then set floating across the harbor waters toward the remaining Christian strongholds, a clear and terrifying message meant to demoralize de Valette and his remaining forces. De Valette's response was equally brutal, and it has been recorded by multiple historical sources as one of the most chilling moments of the entire siege. Instead of breaking down in fear, de Valette ordered that all Ottoman prisoners held within Birgu be executed by beheading. Their severed heads were then loaded into cannons and fired back across the harbor toward the Ottoman positions, landing among their own soldiers. This act of retaliation sent a clear message back to Mustafa Pasha: the defenders of Malta would not be intimidated, no matter how far the Ottomans were willing to go. This exchange of horror set the tone for the brutal months that followed. With Fort St. Elmo finally gone, the Ottomans turned their full attention to the twin fortified towns of Birgu and Singlia, where the majority of the remaining defenders, including de Valette himself, had gathered. These towns were connected to the mainland by narrow strips of land and protected by walls, ditches, and forts on either side. The Ottomans launched wave after wave of assaults against these positions throughout the summer of 1565. They also attempted to use engineering tactics, digging tunnels beneath the walls in an attempt to plant explosives and collapse the defenses from below, a method common in siege warfare of the era. The fighting during these months was constant and exhausting for both sides. Temperatures in the Mediterranean summer soared and disease began to spread through both camps, weakening soldiers who were not killed in direct combat. Fresh water became scarce. Supplies ran low for the defenders, and de Valette had to make difficult decisions about how to ration food and ammunition among his shrinking force. Despite these hardships, the defenders held their lines through repeated large-scale assaults, including one massive attack in August where Ottoman forces very nearly broke through into Singlia before being pushed back at the last moment by a coordinated counterattack. One especially important detail from this stage of the siege is the role played by ordinary Maltese civilians, not just professional knights and soldiers. Historical accounts describe local men and even women taking up arms to defend their homes alongside the knights. Everyday people threw hoops of fire, pots of boiling liquid, and other improvised weapons down onto Ottoman soldiers attempting to climb the walls. This was not simply a battle fought by professional warriors. It became a fight for survival involving the entire population of the island who had nowhere else to go and everything to lose. As the siege dragged on through July and into August, both sides were suffering heavily. The Ottoman forces, despite their massive numerical advantage at the start, were losing thousands of soldiers to combat disease and the brutal Maltese summer heat. Mustafa Pasha and Peel Pasha, the two commanders sharing leadership, reportedly disagreed frequently on strategy, which slowed decision-making at critical moments. Meanwhile, de Valette continued sending desperate messages across the Mediterranean, requesting reinforcements from Sicily, which was under Spanish control at the time. The defenders of Malta knew they could not hold out forever without outside help arriving eventually. That help finally came in early September of 1565. A relief force which became known historically as Il Soccorso, meaning the relief or the help, set sail from Sicily under the command of Spanish and Sicilian forces, organized with the support of the Spanish crown. This relief fleet carried several thousand fresh troops, a force far smaller than the original Ottoman invasion army, but crucially these troops were fresh, well-supplied, and arrived at a moment when the Ottoman forces besieging Malta were already exhausted, sick, and demoralized after nearly 4 months of brutal fighting with heavy losses and no clear victory in sight. When word reached the Ottoman camp that a relief force had landed on the island, panic and confusion spread among the already weary Ottoman soldiers. Mustafa Pasha attempted to organize his forces to meet this new threat, but morale had already collapsed after months of losses, disease, and the death of respected commanders like Dragut. Many Ottoman soldiers had been fighting since May, more than 3 months of continuous warfare in brutal heat, and the arrival of fresh enemy troops was the final blow to their willingness to continue the campaign. Rather than risk a prolonged battle against a fresh, well-equipped force, the Ottoman command made the decision to withdraw from Malta entirely. By the 8th of September 1565, the remaining Ottoman forces began boarding their ships and abandoning the siege. What had started in May as one of the largest and most confident military expeditions the Ottoman Empire had ever launched ended in retreat, defeat, and enormous loss of life, without achieving its primary goal of capturing Malta. The scale of the Ottoman losses was staggering. Historical estimates suggest that out of the 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers who had landed on Malta in May, somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000 were killed, died of disease, or were wounded so badly they could not continue fighting by the time the retreat began in September. On the defenders' side, the losses were also severe relative to their much smaller numbers. Estimates suggest that of the original 6,000 to 8,000 defenders, including knights, Maltese soldiers, and armed civilians, somewhere around 2,000 to 2,500 were killed during the 4 months of fighting. Many of the survivors were wounded, exhausted, and the island itself had been devastated by months of continuous bombardment and fighting. Fort St. Elmo, along with parts of Birgu and Singlia, lay in ruins. But despite this devastation, Malta remained in Christian hands, and the Ottoman Empire had suffered one of the most humiliating and costly defeats of Suleiman the Magnificent's long reign. The significance of this siege extended far beyond the small island of Malta itself. News of the Ottoman defeat spread quickly across Europe, and it was celebrated widely as proof that the seemingly unstoppable expansion of the Ottoman Empire into the Mediterranean and into Europe could, in fact, be stopped. For years, European powers had watched with growing fear as Ottoman forces expanded their control across the eastern Mediterranean and into parts of Eastern Europe. The successful defense of Malta became a symbol of hope, showing that a small, determined force defending a fortified position could hold off and ultimately defeat a vastly larger invading army. In recognition of the heroic defense led by Jean Parasat de Valette, a new fortified city was built on the Sabaras Peninsula in Malta, in the area where much of the fighting had taken place. This new city was named Valletta in honor of the Grand Master who had led the defense against overwhelming odds. Valletta was carefully designed with strong fortifications, wide streets, and defensive structures that took into account everything the knights had learned from the brutal siege of 1565. Today, Valletta remains the capital city of Malta, and its historic fortifications still stand as a physical reminder of the siege that shaped its creation. The Great Siege of Malta also had longer-term strategic consequences for the Ottoman Empire's ambitions in the Western Mediterranean. While the Ottomans remained an extremely powerful force for many decades after 1565 and continued military campaigns in other regions, this particular defeat marked a turning point in terms of Ottoman naval expansion further westward into the Mediterranean Sea. Some historians argue that the heavy losses suffered during the siege, combined with the death of experienced commanders like Dragut, weakened Ottoman naval capabilities at a critical moment, just a few years before another major naval confrontation would take place at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a combined Christian fleet would deal another significant blow to Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean. For Sultan Suleiman himself, the failure at Malta was a rare and bitter setback near the end of his long and largely successful reign. He had ruled the Ottoman Empire for over 4 decades by this point, expanding its borders and its power across 3 continents. The defeat at Malta showed that even the most powerful empire of the age had limits to what it could achieve through military force alone, especially when facing a determined defender fighting on their own fortified ground, for their own survival with nowhere left to retreat. The brutality witnessed during the Great Siege of Malta, from the crucified bodies floated across the harbor to the beheaded prisoners fired from cannons, remains one of the most disturbing examples of how far both sides were willing to go during this period of history. It was a siege defined not just by cannon fire and tactical maneuvering, but by psychological warfare, terror, and acts of retaliation meant to break the will of the opposing side. Both the Knights of St. John and the Ottoman forces used fear as a deliberate weapon throughout the 4 months of fighting, turning an already deadly military campaign into something even darker. Jean Parasat de Valette lived for several more years after the siege ended, continuing to lead the Knights of St. John and overseeing the early construction of the city that would later bear his name. He died in 1568, just a few years after his greatest military achievement, and was buried in Valletta, the city built as a lasting monument to the defense he had led. His leadership during the siege, combined with his personal history as a former Ottoman prisoner, has made him one of the most remembered military commanders of the 16th century, studied for centuries afterward as an example of determined, disciplined defense against overwhelming odds. The Great Siege of Malta stands today as one of the most brutal and consequential sieges in the long history of conflict between European powers and the Ottoman Empire. It combined massive-scale, extreme brutality and a genuinely surprising outcome, where a small, poorly resourced defending force managed to outlast and ultimately defeat one of the largest and most powerful military expeditions the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled. The events of 1565 continue to be studied by historians, not just as a story of military tactics and fortification design, but as a powerful example of how determination, leadership, and the will to survive can shape the outcome of even the most desperate and brutal military conflicts in human history.